All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. My name's Savannah Shelnut. I'm the Ag Climate Resiliency Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I'm based out of the Hudson Valley. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar series today. It's being put on with ourselves at Harvest New York, the Glynwood Center, the Northeastern Carbon Alliance, and Scenic Hudson. So we're really excited to have you all here today. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on YouTube, and we'll be sure to share the link with you all if you would like to view it at a later date or share it with someone else. So really appreciate you all joining today. If you have any questions, please place them into the Q&A at the bottom. You can see the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And so now I just want to introduce Steve Gabriel from Wellsprings Farm. We're really excited to have you here today. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Let's find my slides here. Hope everyone's having a great day. Cool rainy day. It's a good day to have a webinar. Okay, so yeah, just a little of my background. I've been in ag for over 20 years and worked for the Cornell Small Farms program for the last 12 years or so. Been out of that position for about a year. And sort of all along that journey, I've also been building out Wellspring Forest Farm, which does production, education. We have some grant projects and some research going on. So kind of a multifaceted farm, really aiming to be a demonstration farm and really help with a community of folks develop agroforestry practices that are relevant to our region and maybe even beyond. So I was asked to speak on agroforestry generally and just sort of some of the ways it relates to climate smart farming. So I'll speak to that today and some of the places you can find more resources and more food for thought, and happy to chat and have some question time as well. I was fortunate to come across agroforestry personally when I first returned to the Ithaca, New York area, which is where I was spent most of my childhood, and connected with Emeritus Professor Dr. Ken Mudge, who was doing a forest farming class, one of the few classes at Cornell that spent the entirety of class outside, no matter the weather. And so that's really where I learned about agroforestry. First, I'd studied, sustainable agriculture and kind of these generic things. And so agroforestry is really a term that comes out of academia, and it's a relatively new term, really just being coined in the 60s and 70s to describe a number of practices that integrate trees and forestry with agriculture and look at that intersection where we can conserve and promote healthy forests, ecosystems, while also thinking about agriculture production at the same time. So the USDA formally recognizes 5 agroforestry practices, and many of us who have been working with agroforestry in recent times have also named often a 6th practice, forest gardening, to really distinguish it, especially in small backyard urban spaces, things like that. So these are the 6 practices that we might see commonly referred to, at least in the US. But there are really literally hundreds of different practices and different names for these practices when we look at agroforestry as a global phenomenon. So keep that in mind as you're reading and learning about this. But these are the ones that'll show up and are being talked about, might have some funding attached to them, that sort of thing. So all just different sort of sides of the same coin, really. Are we starting with existing forest? Are we working to add trees? Are we integrating livestock? Are we thinking about waterways and riparian areas as a focus? So it's kind of where you're putting your focus. But the reason these circles are all overlapping is because many of these practices have connection and certainly overlap at the end of the day, depending on what you're doing, what your situation is, what you're interested in. So there's kind of something here for everybody, if not multiple practices that could apply to your situation. And from a forest ecology standpoint, that's really my background, what I studied at university. And ecology is always what I've fallen back to really think about the landscape and how we can work in partnership. If we think about starting with a really dense closed canopy forest, that's sort of one end of the spectrum, and on the other end is open field that doesn't have or has very few trees. And these different practices often come from one angle or the other. You can see a lot of them are adding trees into agricultural spaces, which in recent times have not had trees on them, with the exception of really forest farming, which is really focused on the goal of maintaining a healthy existing forest and adding cropping potential to that. And silvopasture, interestingly enough, which we'll dive in a bit deeper, kind of coming from both angles. You can do a bit of silvopasture, whether you have open pasture or more of a closed canopy forest at the end of the day, depending on the goals and the situation. So that can be one way to sort of think about it. And often you can see what we're aiming for in many cases is this kind of mid-succession where we're not quite looking at an open field. We're not necessarily looking at a closed canopy forest, but wanting to get enough light through the trees, because often the cropping that we're doing is on the ground. And I think it's important to acknowledge that while agroforestry is a relatively new term, really maybe 50 years old or so, the practice of agroforestry by many other names is a global phenomenon that's existed in many cultures around the world, many indigenous cultures, many old ways of stewarding land show up. And so we just want to acknowledge that as a piece. There's an academic and a scientific basis for agroforestry, and there's also the communities and the cultures and the sort of wisdom embedded in all these agroforestry practices as well. And a friend of mine years ago created a really wonderful series of videos. If you go to woodlanders.com, highlighting some really powerful examples from around the world of humans in relationship with forest ecosystems for producing a whole variety of different things. So the fellow on the left here, this is a video from Japan, where they're harvesting oak logs for shiitake mushroom production. And this family had been stewarding this same parcel of forest for centuries, passed down stewarding and growing mushrooms. So a very rich tradition of mushroom production, particularly in parts of Asia, relatively new to North America and places we might be tuning in from today. Picture on the right is a mentor and a friend of mine, Mike DeMunn, who's a Seneca mixed heritage forester in the Finger Lakes region, taught me a lot of what I know about forest stewardship, and carries a lot of that tradition and sort of his upbringing into his forestry work. And the forests he manages really are left better than they were found. It's remarkable to see how sustainable forest management can really be a real cornerstone of any agroforestry practice. So what we know is that the climate is actively changing. Any farmer who's been dealing with the ups and downs of the last decade and more, certainly some variability is normal, but we see a lot of trends starting to happen, especially when we look at precipitation, where we have more heavy rain events, periodic, floods, and everything kind of in between. And if anything, the change is providing uncertainty as we move into the future. And certainly some of the predictions present some scary scenarios for us. And so as we think about being farmers and stewards in the landscape, the question really is, how are we going to build resiliency and also contribute to the solutions that climate change really desperately needs? And what I think is really powerful about agroforestry is that when we take healthy ecosystem management and we add trees to that, we are both building resilience to the changes that are already happening and likely to continue to happen, as well as sequestering carbon and contributing to that drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere, which is really what's necessary in the long term to at least stamp out or sort of reduce some of the impacts that are potentially coming down the road. And the real reason for this is because we have the powerful practices of soil building and the carbon storage and cycling that can happen within healthy soils, as well as the practices of trees. And both offer sort of different timescales and different intensities. So you can really stack the highest amount of carbon when you combine healthy soil management with healthy tree management at the same time. So we can think of sort of, this is a slide from a silvopasture presentation. So we think about grassland ecosystems, which perennial long-lived grasses that are grazed on a rotational system can be really quick ways to bring carbon down into soil, build soil health. But they're more volatile. They can break down quicker than the longer and slower carbon storage mechanisms that are trees. And actually, as it turns out, trees do have a lot of above ground carbon, of course, in their trunks and leaves and branches, but they also have a ton in their underground tissue, their root systems, as well as in their interaction with soil. So at the end of the day, it's about creating a system that can really maximize that potential. And that's really where agroforestry has some real significant contributions to the climate space. And on a more practical level, for us on our farm, I think agroforestry became not just a curiosity, but something of a bit more of a necessity when we experienced one of the worst droughts on record. This is back in 2016. Our farm is sort of down on the county line here in the bottom bottom corner of that red area, which was considered extreme drought, where we had persistent dry period coupled with really extremely high temperatures, which proved to be challenging. And that was pretty early on in our sheep grazing experience. And so we had performed a really nice grazing plan and had sort of things figured out, we thought. And then this drought hit, and we did our first rotation of the animals around our pasture, and then came back around, and that first paddock wasn't ready to be grazed again. Essentially, it just didn't regrow, and that's really what can happen persistently with drought conditions, which we've been lucky the last few seasons to not have that issue. We have the opposite issue, lots of excessive rain and the impacts of that, but certainly something that it's probably going to come again. So our solution at that point was really to look at opportunities that we were sort of neglecting the landscape. So we looked at the farm that we owned. Part of this is owned and part of this is leased. We were really focused on the pasture areas, that open pasture, and we had these edges, these woodland edges, which when we added up on Google Earth were about 20% of the total acreage that we had access to. And these were thick, overgrown, mixtures of trees and shrubs and different plants that we really hadn't even looked in or thought about as a grazing resource, because they were actually hard to access at that point. And so for us, the strategy was to fence the sheep into these spaces and see if we could give them some respite from the extreme weather conditions, as well as feed them. And we were lucky that we had selected a breed of sheep called Katahdins, and Katahdins are kind of like a sheep-goat hybrid. They do really well on grasses as well as woody browse. And it was quite successful. We really saw them take to this, enjoy their time in here, and do really well. So we had about a 45-day span of time where there was really no pasture to put them on, and they did really well. And at the end of the season, our hanging weights were really no different than any other year. So it was a real indicator they were able to maintain good sort of body performance conditioning during this really stressful time without any additional feed. So that was a real aha moment for us. At the same time, we had also started to plant trees on the farm more for sort of aesthetic value and a bit of a windbreak. So we had done some swale building for water management, and then planted willow stakes onto this, really just as a way to have cheap material. These were free willows that we cut and staked. We were just looking to save money at that point and said, willow sounds good. So we stuck them in the ground, and willow is an amazing species because very few trees, you can just stick a stick in the ground, it'll actually turn into a tree. So we'd done this in 2014, and here's some pictures of folks helping us kind of finish that swale and do the planting with the stakes. And these swales started to develop and become really important water harvesting mechanisms. So this is after a 4-inch rainfall, where the swale's holding that water and slowing it down and allowing it to soak into the soil versus run off and create erosion problems and other things that were really persistent when we came to this farm. And those trees are then growing on the berm and enjoying that extra water as well. So it's a real nice system that works with addressing extreme rain events and things like that. And by the time this drought had hit, the trees had become more mature, and most of at least 50% of that material was above browse height. And so at that point, we were really looking for just anything to feed the sheep. and we decided to let them have at the willow. And what was interesting was we noticed they would eat it for a bit and then they'd kind of back off. They'd be interested in something else. And this is before we knew that willow is not only a potential source of fodder, of food for grazing livestock, but it's also really could be seen as something medicinal. So the tannins, the condensed tannins that are present in willow, do a couple of things. They actually reduce the methane output of these grazing animals, which is often a critique of grazing systems, is the methane coming off of the animals. And they also help reduce parasite pressure on these animals as well. And so that was part of the reason they're backing off from grazing them, full bore, is because the tannins kind of slow them down, and at some point they get sort of full and want to move on to something else. But it was an interesting observation early on. Now we're doing willow research because we just think it's a really important tree for soil health, for water quality, as well as for fodder. And we're thinking about how do we create banks of this willow. We're really literally banking away tree fodder for the next drought that might come. Hopefully not, but could come anytime, any season, that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about silvopasture. As an agroforestry practice in particular, one of the most potent, because the mixture of rotational grazing of livestock combined with managing of trees, again, really amplifies that carbon potential. And what we see is that the shade and shelter and potential fodder value of trees in silvopasture really provides a lot of benefit to the livestock. And so the stress of livestock in these variable conditions can be dampered down a bit when we think about adding trees to these systems. But what's important is that for a long time, farmers in the US have been just putting animals into the woods and not necessarily paying attention to that balance of the livestock needs, the tree needs, and the forage availability. And that can do a lot of damage. So we're not just putting animals in the woods. We're really thinking about a system where we have periods of residency in a given paddock and also periods of rest. And that rest is really important. If you're familiar with grazing, rotational grazing is all about getting animals in at the right time, getting them out at the right time, and allowing that paddock to recover so that it can be grazed again. And if you do that, you can actually really amplify and maximize the productivity of that land. You can graze a same paddock in 3 or 4 times in a season versus a continuous system where you just have one big open area really isn't going to produce nearly as much in terms of feed. And so when we've organized our grazing system, we think about rotation as an important component, and that's really critical when we start to think about the treed areas where either we're converting woodlands into silvopasture or adding trees into pasture. This is our grazing plan here, just as an example, but animals always need to be on a rotation, and silvopasture is really about orchestrating the relationship between these three, because our role is kind of to bring the animals in, bring them out, monitor the trees and the forage, and make decisions about how they can interact in a beneficial way. And generally, like I've mentioned before, if you start with an area that already is predominant in woody vegetation, whether that's nice big trees up high or scrubby brush down below, that would often be called like a woodland conversion, or sometimes silvopasture by subtraction, where much of the work is to actually remove trees and remove woody vegetation to allow more light to penetrate so that we can develop good pasture underneath. Picture there is at Brett Chedzoy's farm in Watkins Glen, New York, just down the road from me. Brett's extension forester with the Arnott Research Forest through Cornell, as well as CCE Schuyler, and is a great resource for silvopasture. And has some really good examples on his farm, Angus Glen Farm. So that's his. And then, of course, the other option for silvopasture is from the other end, sort of getting trees into pasture. And we'll talk a little bit about tree establishment at the end of the talk here. As I've worked with more farmers and on more projects, I've really started to also think about a third way that silvopasture can show up, which is in orchard management. And that's really different than adding trees to pasture, even though this photo shows an orchard. A lot of folks are adding trees, like things like willow, poplar, black locust, things that are fast growing, more for the shade and shelter, because an orchard is really a whole nother management system compared to those low maintenance trees. Orchard trees tend to take, a lot more care. And so we see a growing number of examples of folks who are orchardists using livestock really to support the health of the orchard, versus using trees just to support the health of the livestock. It's hard to kind of do both because often you need lower numbers of animals to maintain orchard health than might be productive in terms of an economic sort of product. So this is an example from Redbird Orchard, which is close to me in Trumansburg, where they use geese in their biodynamic apple orchard to help maintain a lot of the underbrush. And it's really reduced and eliminated a lot of the need for mowing. So the right number of geese at the right time don't have a negative effect on the trees and have a positive effect on keeping the farmer off the mower, which I think is great. So silvopasture is great. It's always very site specific and always very farmer specific. So whatever those farmer goals are, whatever their experience is with maintaining trees, there's a lot of a learning curve that can happen. And one thing that's important is tree planting is a practice where we plant and we replant and we replant. We've been continuously planting trees at our farm for the last decade or so. It's not a one and done sort of thing. So this is a project I worked on with some chicken farmers in the Finger Lakes region, where we were looking at getting trees established again to encourage these pastured hens to explore more of the pasture and benefit from some of that shade and shelter. And lovely picture, but one of the things happening here is we had just disturbed the soil to plant these trees, and chickens love disturbed soil. And so we quickly fenced these trees out, because if we didn't, the chickens would actually, because they like all that loose soil we just roughed up, probably would do a lot of damage to these young seedlings. And so key to silvopasture is often that time between tree establishment and when the animals can actually interact so that the trees aren't, damaged. So I worked on a project with some partners, Regenerative Design Group, which is out of Massachusetts, and Inhabit Films, who also, by the way, produced that Woodlanders series I mentioned. And what we did is looked for examples of silvopasture all around the Northeast region, and Inhabit made a wonderful series of films really highlighting a lot of different examples of silvopasture. I think they're a really wonderful way to dip in and get some inspiration. We also have case study sheets that provide some more information on the farms and their practices. So if you go to a website for the project, it's just farmingwithtrees.org. You can find the videos there, as well as the YouTube channel, Farming with Trees. And encourage you to check those out if silvopasture is something you're interested in. So another thing we do at our farm, and another really important way that I think agroforestry can contribute to climate smart farming, is through forest farming. And back when I, met Ken at Cornell, I started working with him. I started doing research on his mushroom related work for years, and we co-taught the forest farming class to students. We really loved spending time in the woods, as did the students, and talking about the potential for different, really interesting and innovative and sort of inspiring different kind of funky, interesting crops, I guess I'll say. And that's what I really love about forest farming is just kind of the spectrum of different plants and fungi and fruits and things like that we can play with. So some examples here, we worked with pawpaw, one of the largest native fruits to our region. We worked with American ginseng as a really high value medicinal crop, and we worked with lion's mane and shiitake and other mushrooms growing on logs and wood and wood chip beds and things like that. So really the question of how do we maintain an active forest that's a healthy forest canopy and do other things underneath without disturbing or otherwise impacting that forest in the long term. And I think the key thing to focus on here is what are the cycles and the connections between these different crops and forest management as a whole, because that's an active process where we're always thinking about, what are the healthiest trees, who's going to be here in 10 years, who's going to be here in 50 years, what are the ways that Mother Nature is already thinning this forest, and how can we partner with that timing? How can we reduce some of the impacts of disease or insect pressure? How do we make sure there's a healthy forest? What does regeneration look like long-term for that forest? And so, one of the connections made early on for me was when I moved back to the area, I started learning about maple sugaring and tapping trees, which is a lovely tradition, really unique to, landscapes of New York and the Northeast, where we have this phenomenon of the sap flow every spring. We can capture that and turn it into this amazing product. Of course, that practice is really being impacted dramatically by climate change, because if you're familiar with sugaring, you'll know the way that the winter flows into spring, the freezing and the thawing cycles is really what drives sap production. And of course, spring, that transition is only getting more and more erratic. So we're going to see some really good years and some really poor years for sap production. But at the end of the day, what we're doing when we're tapping trees is we're impacting the health of that tree potentially. And what we want to make sure is that those trees are getting adequate sunlight. And so thinning the forest is often a really important practice so that the trees are capturing that sunlight and able to maintain a healthy stem. And that also directly leads to sap production because, of course, a good healthy canopy can produce where that sap is coming from, that sugar is through photosynthesis. And so a stressed out tree is not producing nearly as high quality or as ample a sap product as a tree that's got access to that light. So thinning can be a really good practice. And often when you're thinning out smaller diameter trees or trees with tops that have smaller diameters. And these become great candidates for mushroom logs. And if you were to cut those trees out anyway and just leave them there, of course, other fungi would come in and break them down eventually to contribute to the forest soil. But why not step in and put something in there that tastes delicious, right? So that's where a lot of our work was thinking about where are those opportunities to thin the forest and then produce what are called mushroom bolts, logs that we can then drill and inoculate with preferred gourmet mushrooms that fetch a really nice premium at local markets. And so that was a lot of the work I did with Ken at Cornell and continue to do on our farm where we're thinning woods, producing mushrooms. And then at the end of the life of those mushroom logs are going back into the forest and contributing to soil health. And so it's a nice cycle and a nice way to connect all those things together. With a lot of the botanicals, we did some work with wild leeks and ramps. We're kind of at the tail end of leek season if you're lucky to find them. And American ginseng as well, we did some work. And I think what's really important to highlight about forest botanicals, they often catch people's attention because of their high value and their potential price. But some key things are that, not all forest types in terms of the species composition, the soil, moisture, even the direction the slope faces or the steepness of the slope, there's a lot of factors to the actual ecology of the forest that make it suitable or unsuitable for these real specialty botanical crops. And so it's really important to, determine if the environments you're looking at are really suitable, because if they're not, you're not going to have much luck. And the other thing is these things take a long time. These forest crops are really slow growing. Their reproductive cycles are complex and long lived. And so this isn't something that is turnkey that you're going to suddenly see a marketable yield, in a couple years. It's something that's a long-term practice. And it's easy to overharvest. So we've seen the impact of overharvesting of both American ginseng and leeks. It's really recommended with the leeks in particular that only the leaves are harvested because as we dig bulbs, we're really quickly potentially depleting the existing population. And so so this is important practice. It's something that could be potentially workable for different landscapes. Often a good sugar maple forest for maple is always also good for some of these botanicals, but it takes some patience. And one thing I like to advocate and encourage is that work needs to be done to save seed and save plant material and propagate that. And often what we see are people are making shorter term sort of economic returns as well as building up their own potential to plant things out efficiently if they do sort of a nursery type operation. So producing plants for their own production as well as potentially selling them to others, engaging in that conservation work that's really necessary for these specialty crops can be a really good way to start. And it's probably better to, start with a little bed of ginseng plants than try to plant an acre, right? In terms of success, because there's a lot of ways you can get tripped up along the way. So I'd really encourage in the book that Ken and I co-authored, Farming the Woods, we talk a lot and interview some folks who started forest nurseries. And that seems like a really viable place to start, I think, if you're interested in that sort of forest botanical and forest farming type work. So those are a couple, things we've zoomed in on in terms of silvopasture and forest farming. Again, there's other agroforestry practices. We don't have time to go over every practice, but those are a couple that I've personally worked on. I think have great potential to both restore forests and maintain existing forests. But regardless of the agroforestry practice, tree planting becomes an important part of that. And so a lot of my work of recent and some of the work highlighted on the Farming with Trees.org website really is a collaborative project where we're really thinking about tree planting and what's needed and what some of the challenges historically have been with tree planting. Because a lot of people fantasize about it. It's a lovely thing to do. It feels really good to plant trees, but survivability and sort of all the things that can happen once those trees are planted poses a real challenge to the success of agroforestry. So we really wanted to step back and say, whether you want to do silvopasture or forest farming or alley cropping, like what is this whole tree planting thing? What can we learn from past successes and failures that can lead us to better solutions? So that's been the project I've been working on a lot since leaving Cornell. And I like the quote from this research paper that talks about global tree planting efforts and some of the lessons learned. It's often viewed as the simple act of digging a hole, putting a tree in and filling the hole with soil. But that's really resulted, just focusing on that has resulted in a lot of trees essentially not making it. A lot of money being spent and a lot of low success rates with tree planting. So when we look at what trees need to thrive, they need a lot of different things. And where you source your stock, the quality of the soil, and if it's compacted or not, the presence of fungal partners, the proper planting technique, the protection of the tree once it's planted from browsing animals and livestock, if there's livestock on the farm, and all these different things really contribute to success or failure. And it can be hard to keep up. If you plant 1,000 trees, that's 1,000 little variables to work with. So really thinking about strategies and ways that we can do better. So on the Farming with Trees website is an article I wrote if you want to read more and learn more about some of these challenges and the ways our project is thinking about them. So there's a lot of different layers to that. One I want to focus on right now for tree planting is the cost. And so a lot of cost share programs are starting to catch up with this. But what we've seen historically is a lot of federal and state programs don't adequately cover the cost of tree planting. And that can be a real barrier if you're expecting a farmer to, cover the cost of especially their labor to, establish the tree and maintain the tree. And what we see is that a lot of maintenance doesn't even happen because, no one's time is being covered and farmers are busy and already overburdened. So from those chicken farms that I was involved with, the project I was involved with, the company who bought the chicken eggs from these farmers helped pilot a project where we looked at what is the true cost of establishing trees in this case. And we tried to document all the variables. We had 4 different farms we worked on and different mixtures of species and kind of different site conditions. And so on average, what we found is just the cost to establish a tree, ended up being close to 26, it was 26.68 per tree, right? So often we see figures from as low as $1 to $5 a tree being the cost. That's sometimes only just the cost of the seedling, and that's a very cheap seedling, which the seedling quality can really also contribute to its success or failure. So there's a report on our website, the Farming with Trees website, again, that documents this in detail. But what we're seeing is more and more people in agroforestry talking about the real cost of planting a tree is probably closer to $20 to $30 when we factor in the labor, the actual tree itself, and the protective material to help it thrive. And so some of the newer grant projects and funding opportunities are starting to catch up with that, which is great to see. Hopefully that'll continue and that more and more of these agroforestry projects can be successful because those costs are actually covered. Another issue that's showing up, and this is an article from the University of Vermont, where they looked at the tree planting initiatives that are showing up as a result of climate change and the available seedling supply. What has been found by several researchers is that there's an inadequate supply of seedling trees, both in the sense of the quantity, the numbers, but also in the quality and sort of where that seed is coming from. So it's very hard, for instance, right now to find, this map is showing red oak seed sources, and you can look at the state of New York here in the middle. There's almost no seed sources coming from the state of New York. So a lot of red oak, if you start buying them online, they're often coming from the Midwest, where some of the bigger nurseries are. And so that's a real deficit that poses a challenge when we think about the number of the growing interest in planting trees, both on farms and in rural areas, but also in urban areas. There's a lot of talk of tree planting for sort of cooling down the effects of climate change in more urban spaces. So where are these trees going to come from? What are we going to do? That's the question. That also presents an opportunity because I think farms are well suited to apply some of their available land as well as some of the skills that folks might have in farming to tree planting and to establishing on-farm tree nurseries. And this is a really important component, I think, for farms who want to do their own agroforestry work because it can really reduce the cost of trees. So that previous slide showed that a tree on average costs $8 to purchase. Well, the trees we grow on our farm cost us much less than that, maybe $1 or $2 per stem. All in, because we can grow thousands of trees in a very small space with pretty low inputs. And some of those trees we can also distribute or sell off farm, right? So it becomes the potential for an off farm enterprise as well. And so that's a lot of our project work is thinking about ways to support farmers to learn the skills and think about tree nurseries as a component of their farm, especially if they're interested in doing agroforestry themselves. And a really inspiring book that talks about this and gives some good resources, and I think a good set of profiles around tree planting and tree nurseries is called Trees of Power. It's written by Kiva Silver, and he has Twisted Tree Farm down in Spencer, New York. And just a little plug, we'll have a workshop on tree nursery production coming up late summer, early fall. And one of the farms we'll work with is, in addition to ours, is Akiva's farm. So if you're interested in that, that could be something to keep your eye out for. You could sign up for our newsletter at the Wellspring site, which I'll share in a minute, or just keep an eye out. We'll try to get the word out on the classes as much as we can. So what we found, in addition to once you get those healthy seedlings, is that site prep and sort of paying attention to what's going on the site is really critical to making sure that the trees are going to do well. And so in addition to your classic soil test, which, folks are probably familiar with, any cropping system is a helpful indicator of things that might be deficient and need to be addressed prior to planting. We've really found with tree planting that a lot of farms have a historical impact of compaction, and that can really affect trees, especially if that compaction is in the top 12 inches of soil. And so we're often going on farms with our penetrometer there on the bottom and testing and really finding out if there's a hard pan or compaction, and then addressing that as part of the tree planting practice, not assuming that we can just stick a tree in a hard soil and expect it to do well. And so we've done different things, like this is a small walk-behind tractor, a BCS with a rotary plow, where we're actually digging up a trench of soil about a foot deep. And so we're planting into that trench. So instead of a small hole, the tree now has some lateral space to grow out into. And that can be really important in the first couple of years of tree establishment to have that. So that can work on some. This worked great on this really steep slope to use that smaller tractor. We also have done things like subsoiling and allowing the rip lines from the subsoiler to become the areas that we plant with trees. Essentially the same thing. We're creating sort of a looser channel that allows those initial tree roots to grow into and fill out before expecting that tree to really take hold and grow. And so those techniques have worked well and can work at different scales as a matter of site prep for successful tree planting. And then things I've just seen routinely, the size of the hole, the way the tree is planted, the depth of the tree, and any amendments added, all those kind of things can be really important to their success long-term. And so we're working on some resources, again, that we'll post to the website to help just get down the basics of how to establish trees and some of the best practices to increase success. Because every time we kind of do one more good thing, we increase the likelihood of that tree to be there. And the biggest thing after planting is really protecting them, giving them that leg up. And so some sort of mulch to suppress vegetation around the tree is really important. Fencing to keep, livestock out. In this case, you can see our sheep are back here in the picture. We're using their net fencing to keep them out. It's provisions for water, to water the trees potentially if it's a drought. I mean, in a good year or a quote unquote normal year, trees can, and a good layer of mulch, trees can do quite well. But we got to plan for those dry years as well. One of the things we're playing with, both to keep some of our livestock off, but also specifically to deal with deer pressure, is what's called a 3D fence. And this is something that I actually learned mostly from the hunting community. People use 3D fences to establish deer plots. And so the idea is that you have a double fence. The back wall of that fence has a double strand. The front has a single strand. And if they're electrified and hot, deer will approach this and not feel comfortable sort of making the jump over. And so this can be a cost-effective way to fence out an area that you want to establish trees in. It's always cheaper to fence out a bunch of trees than each tree with a tube or something like that. So we're doing research with this on our farm. We'll be sharing an article about what we've learned and how to set up a 3D fence with kind of common fencing things, because fencing materials have become more affordable. I think it's one of the more cost-effective ways to support tree planting. And so that's something we're really looking into on our farm as well. So, hopefully provided some examples for different agroforestry, focused a little on the silvopasture, on the forest farming, and then on tree planting in general. Some of the resources I'd encourage folks to dig into deeper. There's a new coalition of individuals and farmers and organizations that's national, called the Agroforestry Coalition. It's doing a lot of work on policy. You'll see hopefully some funding coming in the next farm bill for agroforestry. Looking promising, and that's a lot of the work of folks in that coalition to move that forward and get folks at the government to pay attention to agroforestry. I mentioned our website, farmingwithtrees.org. There is also a agroforestry page through Cornell Small Farms at the bottom here that has some resources through Cornell. Especially Cornell has a very robust maple sugaring program. And I mentioned Brett and others who are doing work with silvopasture. Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri has a lot of amazing online resources. The Savannah Institute is out in the Midwest, also a lot of courses and resources on their website. And then our friend Austin runs Trees for Grazers down in Pennsylvania. And if you're interested in silvopasture, they have a really nice booklet on their website that you can download and learn more about tree planting as it relates to grazing. So hopefully those are some good resources to further your learning about agroforestry. So I've written a book in collaboration with Ken. When he retired, he pulled me in on that project, farming the woods, and also wrote a book on silvopasture. And my contact information is here as well. You can find me if you want to chat more. But I think this is a good time if we want to open up to folks that are here and have some discussion, questions, that sort of thing would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, if you just want to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But I see that we have a question here from Zach Spangler. Do you see a typical cost difference between tree planting on conventional versus organic farms? Maybe site prep effort or materials differ?
That's a good question, Zach. It's actually interesting because the chicken project I mentioned, those pastures are all certified organic, and we kind of ran up against some questions around what is an organic tree, because it's not something that's commonly been established. So there's not a lot of like certified organic trees in that sense. So that's one layer, and I'd say there's a wide range of depending on the scale of the nursery and some of the practices, they may or may not like spray the trees and whatnot, but there's not a lot of like certified organic trees you can find out there. So that's one layer. I think in terms of site prep and materials, like you mentioned, there's certain mulching materials that may or may not be approved. There's maybe certain practices like choosing to use herbicide versus mulch, or mowing or weed whacking as a way to, control vegetation. So there's some variability there. And I would say, the study we did, I guess, was highlighting an organic practice in that sense, because we had to follow those standards. And the main thing came down to the soil the trees were grown in, and then the materials we were applying afterwards. So for instance, we had looked at some tree mats as a way to mulch around the trees and reduce the maintenance of the farm. And those tree mats weren't approved by the Organic Association, so we couldn't use those. We just had to go with wood chip mulch, and that is fine, but it just takes more follow-up and that sort of thing. So But I think overall, subsoiling, some of the site prep things, it may not be a huge difference if you're thinking about a conventional farm. I guess an organic farm might have higher costs or more restrictions in some of the things they use. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, any other questions? Here we go. So Zach asked, how does the cost of 3D fencing compare to tree tubes? How long should 3D fences be left in place?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we are working on that question. We're going to compare. We're working on compiling examples of tree tube or wire cages and kind of different options for single tree coverage versus the 3D fence. We found in general 3D fence averages around to like $1.25 to $1.40 a foot, and so the answer of is it cheaper or more does depend on the number of trees, right? So if you're going to fence out an area with 3D fence but only put 10 trees in there, well, the cost of that fence per tree is pretty high. But if you're going to put 1,000 trees in, it starts to look better. So we're trying to figure out right now what scale of planting, justifies a 3D fence versus individual, tubing. But I'd say in general, if you're looking at, hundreds of trees in a planting, fencing out that group is going to be more cost effective, and we'll have some of those more detailed numbers based on those estimates. The question of how long they should be kept in the places is an interesting one. It kind of depends. So like at our farm, what we're doing is we actually fenced out the perimeter, while still giving space for the deer to follow the creek and the woods edge. Kind of we worked with our friend who hunts our land to really say, where do the deer usually go, and can we just encourage them to kind of maintain those corridors? And those don't conflict with where we want to plant trees. It's just that where we want to plant trees, if they have access, they'll come kind of check things out, and in one painful evening can just nip every single tree. So we've just found really what we're doing is kind of encouraging them to just stay the course, right? And not kind of wander up into the orchard or some of our plantings. And that's what we're noticing is working well. And we've had it up for a year, but we're continuously planting new trees. So we're not planning on necessarily taking it down anytime soon. But I've seen other sites where they'll just 3D fence out a small area for the length of time it takes for the trees to get essentially above browse height, and for the bark to be hard enough, especially if there's grazing animals, to resist rubbing and things like that. So for instance, it really gets species dependent. So things like willow and poplar that grow really fast, that can be a lesser time. But if you're thinking about oak and hickory or chestnut, those fences could be up for 5 to 8 years, really. Could be a while, and they do need to be maintained. That's the other thing, is none of these protective devices are maintenance free by any means. So when we had tubes, we had to pick birds' nests out and deal with the weeds that shot up and got into the tree tube. And now that we have the 3D fence, we got to maintain that and make sure the power is working and all those kind of things. Because if the power is off, it's useless. So they all take time, and I think that the length kind of depends. We found with like our sheep and black locusts as another example, the tree got to above browse height in sometimes as little as 2 years, but the bark actually didn't get hard enough that they wouldn't kind of mess it up for about like 3 or 4 seasons. So it's kind of the combination of those two things, the pressure that you're exerting. So I always say with silvopasture, if folks use like poultry, that's the easy one because they do very little damage to trees. I mean, you don't want to put chickens or geese or something in with little seedlings, but very quickly they can be integrated, versus obviously a sheep is another level up, and a goat or a cow is a whole nother level up of protection and time. So I think it depends a bit, but that's, we're talking about multiple seasons for sure. With any sort of protection system.
Great, thanks so much. Any other questions before we finish up here? All right. If not, then thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate your time, and that was a wonderful presentation. So thank you. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh yeah, Shauna says thank you. But yeah, thanks so much for your time. And if anybody
Thanks,
has
everybody.
any questions, please reach out to me or Steve, and I'll connect you with Steve if you would like to be connected with him. And just as a reminder, next week we're gonna talk about biochar and other soil amendments for climate resiliency. So hope to see you then. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.